Hey, it's the PC Gamer Show. First up, we got a spoiler-free discussion of Half-Life Alyx, followed by some hands-on impressions with Gears Tactics. Stick around. Hello and welcome to the PC Gamer Show for March 25th, 2020. I'm James Davenport. I'm a features producer at PCGamer.com. And joining me today is Chris Livingston, staff writer.
Hello.
Yeah. Well, this is a rare occasion. This is the kind of thing you only podcast once about every 11 years or whatever it is. There's a new Half-Life game out, and we have both played it. You reviewed it, Half-Life Alyx.
Yes.
And I mean, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. It's, I think the just to anyone listening, it's good. So if you don't want any more detail, just, and you have the admittedly kind of tall order of a setup that requires playing it in VR, then just go do it. But we're not going to spoil any specific story beats. We're just going to talk broadly about how it succeeds and some of the things we like about this game, and some like very vague, I think, story hints, but nothing specific at all. So, yeah, Chris, break it down. So, I think in your review, what struck me the most, and I think a lot of folks question it, the biggest question going into Half-Life Alyx is this just like a 15-hour Nito Burrito VR experience, or is this a genuine Half-Life game? And you say, yeah, it's a pretty good Half-Life game.
Yeah, and I mean, like that was kind of the question I think everyone had is like, what is it? Like, it's kind of unheard of to have a, full feature length VR game from I can't really think of any other like AAA big studio full feature full fledged VR games. They're really, I know Bethesda did a version of Fallout 4 and Skyrim in VR, but they weren't built for it. They weren't built from the ground up. So this is kind of a weird situation in that respect. And it's also weird because it's a Half-Life game. Like, I'm not sure we were convinced we'd ever get another Half-Life game. It's been 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
And also weird that it's a Half-Life game that a shitload of Half-Life fans are not going to get to play because it's VR only, at least until the modders get their hands on it. So yeah, just a bizarre situation from kind of all angles. But it turns out it's both a great VR game and it's actually a great Half-Life game too. I really enjoyed it, got into it. I think probably more than any VR game I've ever played, and I've played a bunch.
Mm-hmm.
Typically in VR, I'm like, after 30, 40 minutes, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna take a break. I want to get this headset off. I'm not that into doing this in long stretches, but in Half-Life Alyx, like there were times when I was with the headset on in the game for like 3 hours or more at a time, just because I was really swept up in the story and the fun of it. It's it really works kind of on all different angles.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's another thing we need to reassure people with. Like, we've both played a good amount of VR. This isn't like that early fascination with the medium that like you just won over by literally putting a headset on, seeing or doing anything, because that's a pretty special moment. But we're kind of acclimated in that regard. This is like a genuinely kind of a big spectacle from my perspective, and like you said, a good Half-Life game. But I kind of want to ask you, like, what does being a Half-Life game mean to you, and how is that like translated in Half-Life Alyx? Because this is you're not Gordon Freeman with a speed boost. You're not like literally sprinting around these arenas. These are smaller, tighter spaces, and you're Alyx. You're walking around, using your hands, and not bunny hopping or flying over the level to speed run it. This is a much more grounded experience. But I'm kind of curious what you mean when you say it's a Half-Life game.
I think, Half-Life has always been this kind of mixture of horror and action. You think about the original Half-Life, and there's so much horror in there. It's so scary. There's the head crabs and the monsters and these kind of claustrophobic environments, and you feel like trapped, and you're trying to navigate through these dark places, and there's things jumping out at you. And Half-Life 2 the same way. Half-Life 2 isn't quite as much of a horror game as the original. You have the Ravenholm section and other areas of the game which are really scary. But this one really does carry that kind of aspect along, where there is a lot of horror, and there's also a lot of action. And it, like you said, it's not the action. It's not a one-to-one where, if you think about Half-Life 2 and these really long city warfare segments, or the original Half-Life where you're fighting the Marines or fighting the Black Ops agents in these kind of big, long, extended sequences. These are much more compact and shorter combat scenarios, because you're in VR and it's not really that easy to run around for a long time or run that far, or displace or take cover. These are all things that are difficult to manage in VR, but they're kind of condensed in a way that it still carries that same feeling of these creatures are scuttling at you, and you're trying to manage your reloading and get the right clip on the right gun, and move yourself through the environment. The Combine are kind of flanking you like they used to do. Antlions are running at you. It's not, it doesn't really like technically feel the same, but the sensation you get during these fights feels very much the same as the earlier Half-Life games, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I particularly love the antlions. They're so much fun to fight. I had no idea how they were going to translate to VR, but they turn into these like kind of goofy dismemberment puzzles.
Yeah.
So you shoot each of their legs off to expose their ass, and then you shoot their ass and they explode.
It's pretty
great.
I really love the antlions. Like the you said there's a lot of horror. The first kind of, I would say, almost half of the game is you're in very confined, claustrophobic areas. You're basically, you're in what's called the quarantine zone in City 17, which is like the walls within the walls. It's like this section of City 17 that the Combine are like, we're not even going to deal with the Zen infestation. We're just going to seal it off.
Yeah.
And you go down there, so it's all very spooky and scary and unsettling and disgusting, frankly. And that's kind of, I would say, about 6 or 7 hours of the game, and then you kind of emerge eventually, and you run into this section where the antlions are suddenly around, and the Combine are around, and they're fighting you, they're fighting each other, which is another fun aspect of Half-Life games. Is
when they start combining.
Like a fight in progress. You'll come across a scene where the antlions are fighting the Combine, and maybe they fight you, maybe they fight each other. The kind of chaotic kind of sequence. Yeah, but I really did enjoy the antlion stuff a lot. They're part of the weird thing about going into VR is things feel larger than life, because they're just life size now. Like the Combines seem huge.
They're so intimidating,
even though they're just your height. It's just when they're right there in front of you, it's just so intimidating. And like antlions are I mean, I was like, oh my God, these things are monstrous.
You can pick up their limbs and like inspect them after they've exploded, and it's just like bonkers.
So they're really big. They're way more aggressive. Zombies and head crabs kind of lurch toward you. Thankfully, there are no fast zombies or fast head crabs.
No.
So, yeah, I did really. I think I enjoyed the second half of the game, I would say, more than the first half, just because you have the antlions and you have a lot more Combine, and it's these kind of much more fast-paced, chaotic kind of
Yeah.
combat encounters.
Yeah, and the narrative really kind of picks up in the back half too. And again, not going to go into detail, but I think we can safely say that though this is a prequel, it does inform the narrative, overall narrative, in like some pretty significant ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think there's constraints to creating a prequel because it's like, well, here's the story so far, and then here's the story after it, and
Hmm.
you feel like the writing and story would be kind of confined in an unsatisfying way. But I would say they found some ways to kind of have an impact on some of the things you already know and some of the story you've already experienced in a pretty creative way.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Uh, the kind of ending I had to digest overnight, and I still haven't like fully confronted it yet because I know I'm gonna have to do some unpicking and some real, uh, really kind of pour my brain into it because it's pretty rad.
Yeah, I didn't. I like had no. I don't even know what reaction I had. I was just like, I
Kind of
had no one to
dumbfounded.
talk to about it because no one else on PC Gamer had played it. But when I had finished, I think maybe you guys were just starting, and I was like, I need to talk to somebody, and there's no one to talk to, and I was just like, okay,
Painful.
it's a lot of fun. I think people will be excited to find out what happens, and
Hmm.
uh, I'm sure already discussions are taking place about like what the hell does this even mean. So
Yeah, yeah. We'll have broader discussions on PCGamer.com if you're, because I'm sure people are finishing up uh, now and into next week and the weeks coming. So a lot more people are going to want to kind of unpick what the hell happened. Excuse me. I want to briefly talk about like sort of when I think of Half Life, what I think of and how I think is represented so well in Alyx is kind of that like classic three phase like design. Like Half Life 2, especially, I feel like is a shooter um, on the front, on the surface, but its level design kind of like plays around in a very like Donkey Kong Country kind of way where it introduces new concepts very rapidly and then we'll kind of leave them behind just for the sake of variety. Uh, and in Half Life 2, that manifests in ways like the uh, Antlion chapter, love it or hate it, where you're kind of, you see antlions, you see how they behave, how if you touch the sand, they come out and attack you, and how you can use the gravity gun to phase 2. You can use the gravity gun to build little surfaces to walk across the sand and get by. And then phase 3, when it's sort of like a denouement or like a victory lap, where you often subvert the thing that's been taught to you, and in that chapter you get to use the antlions yourself. The same rules still apply to them. You have to turn off like the thumpers, and the sand needs to be nearby, but they are on your team and helping you out, which is really cool. And there's a lot of stuff like that in Half-Life Alyx, where some chapters are just kind of like one off. All right, you're gonna play around with these concepts this chapter. There's one chapter in particular I think is probably the strongest and the scariest for a lot of people. Not going to talk specifics exactly, but there are stealth sections and uh, and very dangerous monsters. And I typically am like too gun shy to like really delve into those games. But uh, Half-Life Alyx, Valve here, they introduce uh, and kind of buffer the horror with a bit of humor. So gradually in this chapter that there's that I didn't feel like frustrated or like I if I failed it was often because of something I did, and it just like uses VR specifically so well to like use these vodka bottles to distract this creature, and placing your mouth or your hand over your mouth to prevent yourself from coughing, and layers in these like kind of like rules, makes them very clear and easy to follow, and also easy to break because a lot of it depends on like not dropping a bottle. Suddenly your gravity gloves become these like anytime you flick something towards you, which is so satisfying. It becomes sort of like this kind of mini arc of tension as well. So I don't know. I think like to me, seeing those kind of concepts layered in and kind of tested in fun different ways as you get through the game is kind of what makes it a Half-Life game to me, along with the horror and kind of the blending of the action and the different enemy types. It kind of like builds into this really rad crescendo by the end that I don't know. It like I said, you're not sprinting around the arena and you're not using this massive gravity gun to like pull, build huge structures or whatever, or tear things apart. It's a much more grounded, smaller feeling kind of game in that way, but it has that same kind of like satisfying loop and like of Valve being a great teacher and tester at the same time.
Yeah, and like you said, they put all these various tools and systems in there, and then you kind of like they make the most out of how they work to kind of give you interesting situations. Like in that stealth area you were talking about, I was trying to pull this object I needed toward me, and it was through a very small space, and I didn't notice there was a barnacle tongue sticking there. So the barnacle grabbed the thing that I was trying to grab, and I died. And then the next time I'm like, okay, I'll pull something else into the barnacle.
Mm-hmm.
So while he's pulling that up, I'll get the object I need. And so I did that, but then the barnacle doesn't eat things that aren't food, so he dropped the thing which made a noise, which again got me killed. So it's like, oh, okay, I didn't think 3 steps ahead through. Valve obviously wanted me to think a little bit further ahead to figure out how to get this thing I need and get out of here. So there are these fun kind of interplays in their systems that are always kind of enjoyable because they do, they teach you this happens and they teach you that happens, and then they show you what happens when both of those things kind of happen.
Yeah,
So
some nice
and
layering going on.
another thing I really enjoyed was some of these callbacks to earlier Half-Life games that are really
Yeah.
memorable, but now there's this VR element to them. Um, you know, I kind of was like rolled my eyes when I saw there was like these wheel puzzles where you have to find a big metal wheel to stick on a door to crank it. I was like, really, we're still doing wheel puzzles, but now it's in VR, so the wheel isn't just like lying in a corner somewhere. It might be wrapped around something.
Hmm.
There might be a pole kind of holding the metal wheel in place, and you have to kind of um, move it off there. And in a stealth area, you need to do it very quietly,
Hmm.
and you need to use it very quietly. And things like coming into a room and seeing a bunch of explosive barrels and
So
trip
funny.
mines, and it's
So
like
funny.
I just laughed because like, yep, that's Half-Life. There's a bunch of explosive
I
barrels
gotta
and trip
ask,
mines.
is that just like because I feel like there's a great attention to world building and sort of like internal logic to a degree, and like there's a greater emphasis on that in Half-Life Alyx because it's a VR game, so it's got to feel uh, realer, I guess. Is that just the Combine, just like being like, fuck it, if zombies walk in here, they're gonna die? Like, is it just like a why is this happening? Why do these trip mine rooms exist?
Yeah, I don't
And
know. I mean, the Marines did the same thing in Half-Life 1 and set up all these barrels and mines with laser wires so you have to
so
jump over
silly.
them. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Um, so yeah, and the kind of cool thing is, whereas in the original Half-Life, the room with the trip mines is like a jumping puzzle, like a platforming
Hmm.
first person platforming thing. You need to jump over the lasers or crouch under them and things like that. And here there's a VR way to disarm the laser mines. So
Yeah,
it's like you get the reference to the original games, but you have a new way to kind of solve them. So that's kind of cool. It's like it's not just hey, here's this room you remember. There's a twist on it, so it's not the same exact experience. So
yeah,
that's fun too.
yeah. And I kind of like that's Alex's approach to like sort of revisiting a lot of the same scenery and same like combine technology is that and threats is that now that you're so up close to them, how can we change like or deepen the interactions with them? And so uh, I think one of the earliest moments that really struck me was when you're trying to get into the quarantine zone. This is very early into the game, uh, and you need to like use a combine door, basically like hack it, I guess. And so you use this combine console, and there are a lot of these in Half Life 2, and like you see them everywhere. But now you're like pulling it open and apart, and you're seeing like the really fucked up like sci-fi horror up close of the
Yeah.
combine because they're an amalgamation of like genetics and speed. That's their thing, right? Is they take all these other species and like just use them to make tech greater and greater technology. And so when it seriously fucked me up. You like rip open this, you pull open this combine interface or a console, you pull a slot out, and there's a goddamn like flat panel. Well, the outside is like that really like utilitarian architecture. You pull it open, and it's just like these glass panels filled with like brains and tissue and like a rat that's rapidly breathing, and it's all like melding together. It's really gross. It's really gross, and you like
It's
have
like,
to
oh, that's
spin
how that
them.
worked.
Yeah,
They stuffed some sort of living creature in there and wired it up. And why would they do that? It's disgusting and disturbing.
yeah. It really speaks to like their their I guess their motive and like intent, which is to they're trying to take over the human race with minimal losses and minimal force. Um, and to do that, they have this like big elaborate front, to hide the truth of what they are, but really just open any computer and it's like bleh, nasty.
Yeah, there's some sort of like weird pale white worm like wrapped
Oh,
around the inside of the thing, or even just like, oh, I'm gonna go use a healing
yeah.
station. Nope, you're gonna get a glass tube with a living grub in it. And you're gonna stick it in the machine, and the bug is gonna be crushed like right in front, like an inch from your face. It's gonna be liquefied, so you can see that, and then just sort of imagine that this liquefied grub from some planet somewhere or dimension somewhere is being fed into your veins with a bunch of needles. And it's like, my God, this is disturbing.
Yeah, the whole game is like all these innocuous interactions you had in the past suddenly have new context uh, that like heighten the horror. Like going back to Half Life Two after this, I think like I'll bring some of that with me, and they do it like the stuff that they add. I think is really additive and not it doesn't like. I was really worried about the fiction of this world and returning to City 17 because I don't know, it was all familiar and I didn't want like the Half-Life cosmology, which I think is so good for how reserved it is. I didn't want it to be over explained, and I don't think it is. I think it just kind of like heightens the inherent horror in really cool ways and strangeness in really cool ways, and scale, and sort of like the humanitarian tragedy at the center of it all in some really cool ways. And a lot of that comes through with the kind of like set pieces you're working through. And I don't know, like I don't want to attribute it to specifically to the Campo Santo folks, but I get the impression that there's like some of the really good environmental storytelling uh, is kind of coming in on the back of those people that Valve brought in, among others.
Yeah, and I think they've always been kind of good at it too. I mean,
Hmm.
they're without being specific, there are parts where you can kind of, oh, there's is that like a little passageway I can get into, and if you go in there, there's a lot that's reminiscent of like kind of going like in the Portal games when you kind of slip out of the test chamber and kind of behind the scenes where there's these areas. It's like that have a lot of kind of storytelling, and it's like someone obviously is living here and they're not quite right in the head. And
Hmm. Hmm.
um there's little details that makes you, even though you're mostly alone in this game, that makes you feel like people are living there, people are inhabiting the world.
Yeah. Were you? I know you were worried at first about it being a talkier game because you have this new character Russell, who you might recognize from Flight of the Conchords and some other shows and movies. But he's kind of on the comms with you all the time, and there's a lot more sort of contextual VO coming out from Alyx. Did that stuff bother you in the end, or did you kind of endear yourself to it?
I'm not a huge fan of like the guy on the headset who's always talking to you in
Yeah.
games. Typically, I think a lot of games feel like, oh, we better be feeding the player lots of information and lots of personality instead of just like letting me kind of play. And there were one or two spots. I think first there also like this is a talking protagonist like Alyx talks,
Hmm.
which I thought might be a little jarring too, just because Half-Life games, Gordon Freeman never talked, and the character you're playing has never talked. Um, but like that felt natural immediately. I
Yeah.
think just because we know Alyx so well
Yeah.
from the other games where she's around and she talks, and that felt like that did not feel jarring at all. Russell was really well performed and well written. I think mostly I was fine. He didn't seem overly talky. I think there was only one sequence where it was very dark and Alyx had her flashlight and she says like, "Could you talk to me right now, Russell?" Because she was freaked out in the dark, and I was like, "Please stop talking, Russell. I'm in the dark. I need to hear everything that's going on around me." That was the only part, and he talked for like several minutes. I was like, "Please shut up, shut up. I'm in the dark. I need silence so I
I, I
can hear
I felt the
monsters."
exact same. I was like, I
That
get
was
this
such a
as a
yeah,
character. As a character, I can imagine her being like, "Yes, do this," but I was like, "Shut the fuck up! This is so
yeah. I was like, "Dude,
freaky."
not the time,
It's
not
kind of
the
when the
time."
horror really kicks in a big way. So it's
Yeah.
inopportune, but kind of funny. Yeah,
Mostly though, I felt like I didn't feel like the talking was too much. Honestly, I felt a little lonely for parts of the game.
yeah.
One of the first things that kind of occurred to me as I was playing was like this feels very solitary compared to Half-Life 1 and 2, because Half-Life was so cool. There were all these scientists and Barney guards just all over the game from start to finish who you'd encounter, and you couldn't talk to them, but they would be around and they'd talk to you and walk up to you and follow you around. And Half-Life 2, obviously, there's lots of people kind of always in your vicinity. Um, and I felt like that was kind of a shame that there's not that much of that in Half-Life Alyx, partially because it's just so cool in VR to be sharing a space with another character,
Hmm.
talking to them face to face. And there are a few scenes like that. But there wasn't really very much. I think just part of it's that you're in a quarantine zone, so there's not going to be people hanging around. But I did kind of miss that. I wish there were more people that you spoke to face, because that's just such a cool thing in VR. Just like I said, how the combines seem larger than life simply because they're life size. It's like it's really just interesting and kind of arresting to have a character, standing a foot away from you and talking, and that just doesn't happen that
I
much.
kind of wonder if some of that got tested out because I love that stuff too, and the some of the times that happens, I was like kind of sitting there slack jawed. Then again, I'm like a huge Half Life
Yeah.
fanboy, but so I was extra enamored when I saw some of these, like familiar uh, types of characters and archetypes, like in VR. I was like, holy shit, talk to me forever.
Yeah.
But
Well, I know that when I talked to Dario Casali, who's a level designer,
yeah,
and Eric Walpaugh, who's a co-writer. And one of the things we talked about was how much they had to kind of trim down
yeah,
these kind of character scenes and story scenes, just because in VR, I think players are typically kind of impatient. Like in any game, it's like, yeah, stop talking, I want to go play and shoot stuff. And in VR, it's definitely heightened. Like you typically just want to be moving and picking up things and
yeah.
not just staring at someone talk. You want to be looking around, and you get very restless and fidgety. And they told me they had to really kind of cut a lot of scenes down, make them shorter, make them more condensed. The introduction, Dario told me that used to be an hour or two before you got to holding your first gun.
Shit.
And it was just people are just way too impatient in VR. You don't want to stand around. You feel very active and involved.
Hmm.
So there are definitely fewer of those kind of scenes, which is probably good. I don't think at any point during any of those scenes I got like bored. I did just want to kind of stand there and stare at whoever was talking and take it all in. But it does feel like in that way a bit of a departure from some of the earlier games.
Yeah, and when you do run into people, it's an event, or characters, it's an event. There's, so I think, I don't know, it's not, it doesn't, I think, detract terribly from, the overall, my overall feelings about the game.
Yeah.
But I do, and I think it's sort of it's helped by the fact that a lot of these, there are like distinct stretches where there's like just no combat, and there are areas that you're just meant to fuck around in, and explore. Like, I think that's one thing I noticed about the pace of my play was in Half-Life. Like there's a lot of that good environmental storytelling, and you can linger in a space and usually pick something up, but it's a fast game. Half-Life and Half-Life 2, you're extremely, your feet are made of butter and you're just sliding through those worlds. But here, like, I was just spending time room by room, kind of inspecting, picking stuff up, playing with stuff, poking around. Especially in some rooms, there that are have some really cool interactive elements. I mean, like, we've been putting out stupid videos, like kind of on our second runs of the game, playing with physics and all the toys that are just kind of like hidden around or plainly there that you kind of just don't notice because maybe you're trying to get through and get to the meaty story bits. But it's kind of astounding how much there is to just kind of play with, and uncover, that I think, like, my traditional video game habits like condition me to kind of gloss over and skip over. But I highly recommend people kind of linger and play around, because there's a lot to find. Did you
Yeah,
find yourself
it's
kind
a
of slowing down and doing the same?
yeah, I would, my first impulse is like, okay, I need to kill everything that might threaten me in
Yeah,
here, and
yeah.
then I'm gonna kind of backtrack and check things out because like I do love exploring, but I am not a big horror fan, so I'm like, I don't want anything jumping out at me when I'm trying to, see if I can juggle with three bottles or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would typically kind of move through a level as quickly as seemed safe, and then kind of turn around and backtrack and go, oh, did I miss anything? Are there, that door I saw? Can I get through there? What was down that stairwell? Or what's in this office? And kind of after I'd cleared everything out, I'd be like, I'm going to open every file cabinet and see if there's anything under the desk and things like that.
Yeah.
It is a really enjoyable, um, kind of uh, sandbox in terms of going into a space and just looking at it and digging around in it from every angle.
Yeah, I hope that some kind of God mode or like, museum mode comes out. I would just like to, you know, hang around and get up closer to Combine and, some of the enemies and inspect them a bit more because,
Yes, and also like there was some kind of fun eavesdropping
yeah,
on Combine talking to each other.
yeah.
So if you ever find yourself coming up to some Combine and they haven't seen you, it's a great game to kind of hang back for a minute and see if they're having a little conversation about something because those were some really fun moments in the game
Yeah,
too.
kind of petty soldiers. It's weird because they sound like just, I don't know, boot licking dude bros. But you, the another surprising thing is like seeing I don't know, a Combine with their face mask knocked off and the weird, horrific, Combine biology behind the mask. It's, pretty nasty. Very gross game, very gross and scary game. But still pretty good. Anyway, I think we're about out of time here, but, obviously, this game comes highly recommended. Go read that review. PCGamer.com/reviews. We have a bunch more, and we'll have ongoing Half-Life Alyx coverage as we kind of like spend time, digging in to every nook and cranny of that game. There's a lot to uncover and talk about for sure, and play around with. It's a fascinating one, and it feels nice. It feels nice to have Half-Life back.
Yeah, it's a new Half-Life game, and it's really good. I
Yeah.
mean, that's pretty exciting news on both fronts.
Yeah. Hope.
And hopefully, it won't be 13 years before we get another one. Hopefully, it'll be
Oh my God!
hopefully
Please
it'll
no.
be within a year, a few years,
I can't do
because
this again because I had like just resigned over the last like 2 or 3 years to just never playing a Half-Life game again, and then Valve comes out and it's like, "What's up? Here you go."
yeah,
So I can't go through it again. This is one of my favorite series, and I think we were both mentioning this. I don't typically like get hype for games like I used to, but if anything can get me kind of riled up, it's Half-Life. I have a lot.
yeah. There
Strong
were
affection
there
for
were really some moments where I felt genuinely thrilled
it.
just by. I mean, and I'm not just talking about like shooting things or juggling stuff in VR. It was just someone would say something that
Hmm.
pertained to Half-Life history, and I would just like feel this kind of. I would feel kind of electrified. I'd be so excited just to be hearing about um, people talk about like events in Half-Life history in the game, and it was really, I think I'm a pretty, I don't know, jaded guy, but I really felt like genuinely thrilled at some of the stuff going on in there with the story. So it was great fun.
If it's a glowing recommendation, if you're jaded and your soul is just a burning kind of like dying ember, there's hope yet. Play a Half-Life game. Okay, that's gonna do it for us here. Up next, Wes and I are gonna be talking about Gears Tactics. So thanks again, Chris, and I hope maybe we can do a spoiler episode or something like that because I need to
Yeah,
like
it'd be fun. I
work
think
through this
people.
together.
I think people will. I think people would be wanting to hear all sorts of theories and things like that. So.
Wes Fenlon and I are going to be talking about Gears Tactics right now, but we are talking over footage. There's a video. If you want to see the accompanying footage here, you're going to hear that happening in the background. Go to youtube.com/PCGamer if you want to watch that whole thing, see what we're referencing. But it's entirely listenable here. We don't reference the footage too much directly. We kind of talk about systems at large and changes at large. And the genre at large. So I think this is entirely listenable. But if you kind of want, if you're curious, go to youtube.com/PCGamer. See the rest.
Hey, this is Wes, PC Gamer, and joining me is James from PC Gamer. James, I've dragged you along to talk about Gears Tactics a little bit with me, as well as some XCOM, which is like the natural point of comparison for this game.
Yeah, and you chose correctly, Wes, because these two things intersect perfectly in my interests. So I'm pretty excited.
So big beefy boys and tactical
Tactics,
combat.
baby, you know it. It's a dream come true.
So I got to play I'd say about 3 hours of Gears Tactics a few weeks ago, and captured a bunch of footage. And we're gonna just watch kind of run through a whole mission up until the point where, spoilers, it doesn't go super well for me at the end of this one. This is actually the first mission that I failed. But I think the fail run is actually more entertaining than the doing it right and completing the mission run, because I got a little over aggressive, which made me then try really creatively to get out of the hole that I was in. So we'll see that a bit later. But this kind of first chunk of the game is we're seeing like a short cutscene where you can tell like this game has like a legit, Gears Unreal Engine graphics engine powering it. It doesn't feel like it's just a, zoomed out top-down strategy game when you get those cutscenes. And then from there, you get to jump into something that looks a lot like XCOM, but kind of freed from the camera grid and the grid at all. Your characters actually don't move on a grid.
Yeah, it looks firmly in the Gears universe and XCOM universe. But I'm digging this pretty familiar top-down view. Like I feel kind of right at home immediately as a big tactics guy.
Yeah, so in the first few minutes of footage here, you can see probably like a lot of the major things that differentiate this from XCOM, in that your characters are not moving on a grid, and they don't have the same kind of rigid like action move or move action kind of cadence that you have in XCOM. You know, with a basic character in XCOM, if you fire your gun, that's it. Your turn's over, right? And there's some abilities you get later on that can mitigate that or let you fire twice or whatever. But Gears is a lot more freeform from the very beginning, which I actually really enjoyed. I've been playing XCOM 2 after I did this Gears Tactics preview because I kind of wanted more basis for comparison. And I get really frustrated every time I'm like, I want to shoot this guy and then go move somewhere, that it doesn't let me do that. So that's one of the things I enjoyed in this game right off the bat.
Yeah, and how do you think that like changes up how it articulates it, in a match or excuse me, a given scenario? Does that change the play style and sort of like your decision making overall?
I think it definitely does in ways that are, it probably makes the game a bit easier in that, in XCOM, like you really have to be on the ball with your decisions. You have to really think through the order in which you're taking these actions. And in this game, because you can, for example, have a character just fire 3 times in a row. If you wanted to stand there and just shoot a guy, shoot him again, those are your 3 actions. You have a much wider range of possibilities of how you're going to mix these things up. So it's a little bit less tense when you make a decision. You haven't just like screwed yourself if you do things out of order. You have a little bit more opportunity to fix a mistake like that. But it also means you can kind of sit there and just be like, okay, if I have 4 characters, that's 12 moves I can be making in any order. Like, what should I be doing here? Right. So there's definitely still a lot to think about, even if the game is like a little bit less rigid.
Gotcha. So one big difference I'm noticing here that gets me pretty excited when thinking about the possibilities is this how Overwatch works in Gears Tactics. Can you explain kind of this cone focused Overwatch?
Yeah, it's probably the most obvious difference between the two games. I guess that and the fact that you're not moving on a grid, right? Yeah. So in XCOM, if you put a unit on Overwatch, they're just like looking for any movement within their line of sight, their gun range, and if they see movement, they'll just shoot, right? Mm-hmm. And in Gears, you choose to put a unit on Overwatch, and then you draw. It gives you like a cone, an aiming cone, which you can see me doing right here. So I'm aiming and saying, if anything moves within this cone, I will fire upon it. So it makes Overwatch a lot more specific because you're even trying to decide like, okay, do I want to draw the cone, kind of as far out as my range will allow, which means you're not going to have the same accuracy if you do end up firing on an enemy that like just barely comes into their range.
The cone too, yeah.
It also, so you can decide, do I want to be shooting at people where I'm less accurate further away? Do I want to be trying to cover a wider angle here versus covering a very specific angle? And so it makes for some interesting give and take, especially around like an emergence hole, where I'm trying to put Overwatch over this emergence hole, which is one of the ways enemies will spawn in this game, is they'll just kind of pop up right behind your lines or, kind of within your combat area. And you might not be able to cover the whole ring around the emergence hole with the Overwatch, so you're kind of going like, shit, where do I think they're gonna pop up out of this hole? And so that's definitely a consideration.
Yeah, it's interesting too because just real quick, you can see the enemies Overwatch too, so they can just lock down specific spaces that you maybe have to then make very obvious like detours around.
Totally. And another big thing about it too is it plays into the action point system. So if you put a unit on Overwatch with your first action, they can actually fire multiple times at the enemy instead of it just being a one and done thing. So there is a difference between choosing to move and then go into Overwatch versus going, okay, I'm going to just sit here in this space and use all my action points to go on Overwatch. So here we're starting to see what happens when you're a little over aggressive with your positioning. I got my guy Sid out there thinking, okay, I'm going to put like a pincher move on these enemies, hit them from both sides, and didn't account for the fact that they were going to pop out of the emergence hole and then immediately get to take their turn. So they basically just got in there and fucked him up with their shotguns immediately. And that really put me on my back foot trying to figure out, okay, how do I get over to this guy and revive him to keep him from dying? And what can I do about these emergence holes? You just like in regular Gears, you can throw grenades in them. Yeah, so you can stop more enemies from spawning. And if you don't do that, as I will discover a bit later, it can get really bad, right? Just too many enemies for you to be able to contain.
Yeah, that's cool. That's like that Gears experience translated nicely into tactics form.
Yeah, one thing I would say different between this game and XCOM is you generally have cooldowns on abilities instead of just limited resources. I mean, a lot of XCOM abilities have cooldowns, but something like a grenade, right, in XCOM is like a one-time use item, or maybe you get like a couple uses out of it when you do upgrades or whatever. But in this game, mostly stuff is unlimited use, but you're going to have to wait quite a while to be able to use it again. So I just used a heal grenade from my like support character to wake up Sid, which is going to buy him a little life here, but he is still like pretty stuck, pretty tough spot. Yeah. And this is another cool ability for the more like the ranger character, where you can use a dash move to go in a straight line and cover a lot more ground than you normally would. But it has to be in a straight line, so you run into some limitations.
That roadie run.
That roadie run, exactly. It's kind of cool how much of the Gears mechanics they actually translated into a tactics game. The emergence holes, the roadie run. There's a lot of stuff, like all of the finishing moves are a big thing in this game to eliminate enemies.
Yeah, they win you an action point, right? If you kind of take the risk and get up in there.
They do, which is probably my favorite thing in this game, actually, is, it throws a lot of enemies at you. Like you just saw, I just killed four little, I forget what they're called, grunts, wretches, I don't know, four little guys, like with one grenade.
Four little guys.
Yeah, but there's a whole nother like squad of them coming. There's heavier enemies with shotguns and rifles. So it throws a lot of enemies at you. And if you're playing defensively the whole time, it doesn't mean you're going to lose, right? You can certainly play defensively if you want to, but the way the game really encourages you to play is to be aggressive and get execution moves on enemies, because when you do an execution with one unit, the rest of your team get a bonus action point to take. So you really can start stacking up extra actions by having one character kill somebody, get a finishing move, and then have another character do it, and you can just keep winning actions for the rest of your team, including somebody who you've already blown through all three actions for, which is really pivotal if you're like, my sniper is the only person who can hit this enemy across the map. Okay, well, if I can kill somebody and get an execution with a different character, then my sniper can take another shot and hit that enemy that was gonna, finish me off next turn or something. So that's when the free form, every character having just a pool of actions gives you even more to think about, because you're like, okay, how can I win yet more actions for this team, and then what order should I be taking all of them in? So.
Yeah, and most of those actions are extremely risky. It's kind of that Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal philosophies of just get in there, because the only thing that will win you back any advantage is, ironically, just getting up into kissing distance with your enemy. So.
Exactly. So here we can talk a little bit about some UI stuff. You see the lines with all the characters that shows you who you can hit, which I think is a really nice touch. You can see just at a glance, what enemies you can shoot. You can see if a character has a yellow health bar, that means that they are down and bleeding out. Same for the skull next to an enemy, that means you can execute them. So like right next to Sid, who is executable, and I think on higher difficulties you'll find that your enemies will actually execute your gears if you let them be on their knees for too long. But you can do the same to their guys, obviously. So if you don't save somebody within a certain number of turns, they're going to bleed out, and they actually lose a chunk of their health too when they revive. So if you look at Sid's UI here, you can see like two kind of X'd out squares on it, and that means when he revives, he's only going to be at half health because he's been downed twice already.
Gotcha.
So it makes it more likely that they're going to get killed again.
Right, kind of whittles away at you overall, even if you have things like the health grenades that give you health advantages and revives and such over a long distance. So that's cool. It kind of gets you in and out of the action a lot without just making you 100%.
Yeah, so here I managed to revive him, and I'm about to make, I believe this is when I make a pretty big mistake, or maybe that's next turn. So I've got Sid up, and I'm trying to think, okay, should he use this ability to intimidate all the enemies around him, and that will like set them, it'll break their Overwatch if they're in Overwatch, it'll also like break them out of cover, but it wasn't really useful here because none of them were in cover right now, nobody's doing Overwatch, so I'm kind of trying to figure out like, how can I heal somebody? What's the right move here? And I think I'm about to pull a chainsaw move here, which is actually different than an execution. It's just like a straight up finishing move. But I picked a grenadier enemy, the ones with the shotgun, and they actually have like a close range, like defensive ability, basically, where if you get close to them, they will automatically shotgun you. So I totally wasted that move, and then I think I'm about to waste it again with this bayonet charge, thinking it's gonna work. I forget. We'll see what happens here. But there's like all the different characters have pretty cool dynamics. Like I've got this machine gun guy over here, chain gun, who will do some healing based on how long they stay anchored. I think they'll do some healing, and they get like a buff to their damage over time, I believe. So their character is kind of built around pretending like they're a turret, right? And so you're this big guy with this giant gun. The better your positioning, the more points you're going to kind of get in your favor every time you stay in that one spot and keep shooting. So it encourages you to like position them perfectly and then just kind of hold the line with them versus moving them around too much.
Gotcha. Did you get a sense there were, I guess, long-term upgrade paths or kind of stat allocation paths that let you kind of carve out different playstyles within those classes, or are they pretty static?
Definitely. So I would say it's even more varied than XCOM 2 is. So here we got a execution that's going to give everybody on the team a bonus action, which you see in the UI, so that's pretty cool. Nice. And then I tried to use the bayonet charge, thinking it was going to work, and then he gets an attack of opportunity. Down Sid again. So at this point, if I don't revive him, he's going to bleed out this next turn, and I would lose. There's actually, you have like hero characters in this game. So your two like starters are Gabe and Sid, and if either of them die, you fail the mission, basically. So this game has kind of a mix of like your XCOM-y, create a character, random squad guys that you just recruit and can customize, and then your more heroic characters. And they actually have some special abilities too that not everybody has. So it's kind of fun, it's like you get a little aspect of that hero shooter kind of design in here, but for the most part your squad are just disposable grunts that you can customize.
Okay, interesting.
So yeah, let me talk about the skill system a little bit. In XCOM, you have each character has like two options every time they level up, whether you want to, your sharpshooter can kind of lean into their sniper rifle, or they can lean into their pistol. In this game, you have like four, there's kind of there's a two-sided skill tree, and we can show a little bit of this. The skill tree on the left will go up and down into two separate paths, and then on the right, up and down into two separate paths. So you can basically have four different specializations for each class, and those specializations you can also kind of mix and match, right? So you're not going to be able to fill out the entire tree with a character before they hit max level, but you could pull, a few abilities from the left side that might, make your ranger character, for example. You can pick some characters that make them able to move further in one turn than a normal character would, and then you can kind of go on the other side and pull up some skills that make them do more damage in combat or something like that. Gotcha. So there's a decent amount of mixture there. I think you'll actually end up with characters who are a little bit more customized than you would in XCOM in terms of which skills you pick to make kind of amalgamate your own version of a class.
Right. You're not sitting pretty here, Wes.
No, it's going pretty rough.
Something I'm noting here is that, like, and I'm wondering if you felt this, that the enemies are just pouring in. Like, XCOM would kind of surprise you and ambush you from all sides, but this seems to be about, like, kind of an onslaught from all angles, and a lot of these systems, skill systems and character abilities seem built to support pivoting hard. Did you kind of get a sense that is sort of part of the design?
Yeah, and talking to the developers, like, they were definitely about putting more enemies on screen. And I think the enemies are generally not as hardy as enemies in XCOM could be, but there are a lot of them for sure. And it makes you strategically think about, like, am I going to close this emergence hole? You know, so one of the problems that I ran into on this mission was I kind of blew through my grenades too early, and then they were on very long cooldowns. And because I kept trying to revive this character too, I didn't get a good chance to close this other emergence hole. And so that adds, more characters coming out than I might otherwise be having to fight. So you definitely need to be careful about some of those abilities as much as it pushes you to be aggressive. If you throw all your grenades and then an emergence hole pops up, like you just got to figure out how to deal with it, So yeah, there's a lot of enemies closing in. And I was really I was just kind of on my back foot at this point, trying to figure out, how do I kill these guys? How do I keep this one character from getting downed again, get him to safety? A lot of my abilities were on cooldown. So I was definitely panicking a little bit.
That's good though. It's like prying yourself out of these corners you accidentally paint yourself into is part of the charm of these games. And, you get close at times, and it shows that it is possible for you to get out. Had you known a couple more things.
Yeah. So here I was trying. I was hoping that this plant a grenade ability would work as closing an emergence hole. It does not. You have to throw the grenade into the hole. So I was just kind of placing it like a claymore. So that's not gonna do it for me.
Gosh.
But we saw a second ago too the enemy being on Overwatch, and I actually ran my character just out of that Overwatch to get him into cover. But one other cool, I guess you'd call it an ability they put in this game, is you have a thing called I think disrupting shot, something like that, which you can use to knock enemies out of Overwatch. So you can shoot them with your pistol with that move, and then that'll knock them out of Overwatch, and then you can run through where that line of sight would have been. So, in XCOM, you can just injure an enemy to, disrupt Overwatch or something like that. But I thought it was pretty cool that they had like that there was a feature that they consciously built in here. And as a result, you'll see enemies use Overwatch a lot. And it's a big factor of the game is figuring out how you disrupt that so that you can move safely.
That's rad. Did you get a sense that there's because from what I can tell, this is more of a bespoke campaign. Are there any like randomized elements when it comes to level generation or like familiar metagame stuff between missions?
Great question. So it doesn't really have the metagame stuff that XCOM does in terms of building out your base. You're gonna pick up items that you use to customize your character's weapons. So there's a lot of there are a lot of different parts to the weapons that you can change out. Like barrels and sights and handle, grips and clips and all that stuff. So that's how you'll be customizing your characters mainly. There is some other aesthetic customization, but you're not going to have the same like detailed armor system and like doing all the research and stuff that you will in XCOM. It's definitely more focused and straightforward. But it will have some degree of those like random levels to go on. So it's very much a narrative campaign. There's cutscenes, before and after every single level. But kind of when you get closer to the end of an act, you'll have choices of like side missions to go on, and you'll have to complete like a set number, maybe 5 or something side missions before you go to the big boss fight at the end of the act. And a boss fight is actually one of the big differences between this and regular XCOM. So you will get some of those kind of non-narrative driven side stories that you can go on to just like level up your characters. So and that's the end of Sid there. Somebody came out of the emergence hole. I had kind of made a gamble with that grenade, putting it on one side, hoping maybe they'll spawn there and it'll take them out. Did not take them out, so I had to re-roll the mission. But we'll save that for another time. That'll do us, I think, for this one. Any closing questions though you have for this and XCOM?
No major questions. I'm just, well, I guess. Do you think this is something a bit more accessible to tactics people than something like XCOM, without necessarily being less challenging?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, XCOM has a lot of systems that it throws at you, especially if you're playing like XCOM 2 War of the Chosen, which adds all these other, elements which are really cool, but it's just a lot, right? This game, you're going to get to do some of the fun character customization stuff, but for the most part, you're just going to be in the strategy mode and just doing missions. So I think it's a lot, if you feel like you want to play XCOM, but you don't want the overhead of like, I have to understand the world map and I have to like balance the timing of when I go on these missions before, otherwise they're going to like invade me and, complete the Dark Project or whatever. You don't really have to worry about that stuff in this game. So if you want that grand strategy feeling, this might feel a little bit too stripped down for you. But if you really are just into the tactical combat, like I think Gears Tactics is going to be really fun.
Wow, looks pretty neat.
Cool, so that'll do us for this convo. You can also check out a preview I wrote on the website, talking to the developers about making this a very PC-focused game, doing a lot of the same technology stuff that's in Gears 5, really, in terms of graphic settings, a lot of accessibility options that are pretty cool. And it's like Gears Tactics is out on April 28th, so we'll be able to play it in a month.
Took you out.